Good afternoon, and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Michael Morgan as our speaker. Dr. Morgan is a published author and international lecturer on cosmetic dentistry, implant dentistry, and anxiety-free dentistry. At any point during the webinar, we encourage your participation. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A section of your control panel, and we'll answer them live at the end. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand, and this webinar is sponsored by Kuraray. Dr. Morgan, thanks for joining us.
Okay, folks, thanks for tuning in. So this is Uncomplicate Your Restorative Workflow for this evening. So thanks for joining us in bright and sunny Chicago, wherever all you folks are. So that's what my daughter says I look like before I have my Red Bull in the morning. So a little bit of my background: I practiced in Hinsdale. I graduated from a few places. I taught a few places. I've done some hands-on courses. So this isn't, just in case you're wondering, this isn't my first rodeo. And this is where I'm talking to you from right now, lovely Hinsdale, Illinois, which is about almost 18 miles west of downtown Chicago. So a long, long time ago in land far, far away, I wrote an article called Lessons Learned from My Daughter. And one of the most important points in there was simplify your juggling and simplify your life. So we're going to talk about that. You know, I simplified my practice. I had a big group practice where we did a little bit of everything. And now I do primarily cosmetic and restorative procedures. And we're going to talk about simplifying composites as part of that simplifying of your life process. So as always, the quest is always, how do we make the unnatural look natural? Whether it's an old amalgam or it's an old composite, how do we make it look lifelike? And these days, there's even more of a premium on how do we do that efficiently? Because I used to spend an inordinate amount of time doing my anterior composites, sometimes on a single tooth for something real complex, up to a couple of hours. And as we all know, especially the way things are today, with economies and patients being very mobile and picky about a lot of things, we have to be more efficient. So composites kind of my thing. It's what I love to do. It's what I enjoy seeing on the schedule every day. We do a lot of more complex things than that, foam mouth rehabs, implants, things like that. But I still love my composites. So, you know, I've redone whole mouths in composite or something way back, a lot more simpler. So let's talk about, if we're going to simplify things, how are we going to simplify shade taking? Because we have to figure out what composite or which composite we're going to use before we actually learn the technique to use it. So what's the most important part? What's the most important component of shade taking? Value, hue, or chroma? I would venture to say it's value, the amount of lightness, or as I tell patients, if your teeth are light or less light, not dark. So a tooth that's way, the person you see come walking down the street 10 blocks away and you can see their single central that they had done somewhere. It's because the value's off. The hue may be decent, the chroma may be decent, but usually the value is way too high. So if we look at teeth, one of the ways we can assess that is with black and white. So I do that in the office, especially when we're doing composites, is take black and white photography. And that's really easy to do. You take the color on the left, you go into Photoshop, you slide the saturation bar to 0, and you get your black and white. So you can take, pre-op dentin shades from about the gingival 1/3. That's where you're going to see most of the chroma. There's different kinds of, we'll call them aids for taking shades, such as True Shade, things like that. So we're going to talk about a couple of Kuraray's products or systems tonight. And ES2 was my first step towards simplifying composites. So instead of using different composites from different companies with different shades, basically we simplified it down to just using ES2 and having either a dentin shade or enamel shade if you want to layer, or if you don't want to layer, they have a classic shade that you can just use. It's a single shade, like a universal shade. So they're key to the Vita Classic system. So we all know what that is because we all got smothered with that in dental school. So With clear fill, ES2, there's a shade guide and it talks about basically, you have your classic single shade technique, and then you have your premium dual shade where you have a dentin and an enamel shade. And what they've done is they've simplified it again. And notice I'm going to use that word a lot. They've simplified the shade guide and our ability to use it down to 5 shades. So they're arranged by value or lightness. So these 3 shades we can cover with A1, these 3 with A2, et cetera, or with combinations thereof. There's real simple, like little shade guide kind of cheat sheet for that. And that would be this. So if you're trying to replicate these shades, use A1 dentin and A1 enamel. These shades, A2 dentin, A2 enamel, et cetera. So it makes life super easy. You don't need 32 shades in a box, because we all know by the time somebody comes in, they really need that D4, it's going to have expired anyway. So it's much better to have something that's practical, a system that's practical, but it's also has durability, has a lot of studies behind it, and has wonderful aesthetic results. So if you were going to do a layered technique, you could use a dentin and an enamel, biomimetic system placement. And then, I already showed this one up there, sorry. Then shade taking, the same we talked about. You're going to go by value first, and then look a little more at chroma. And then if you're going to do dual shades, you can layer in the posterior, layer in the anterior. And I'm going to show you later. I used to do, even in the posterior, I'd always do at least 2 shades, sometimes 3. Now just 1. We'll talk about that. So it doesn't get much simpler than single. So if we're going to do, let's say, class 1 composites with function and aesthetics, you see 2 old composites here. I took those out, and just by putting a dentin layer down first, then an enamel layer, and cutting the grooves pretty deep, the dentin shows up through. So that's not stain or tint. It's just the dentin layer showing through. And with multiple class 2s, I'll show you later how I try to simplify these and make them a little quicker, a little faster. And so you can have something that's, that's not super detailed anatomy. There's no, like I said, stains and tints in there. I think these days we're all trying to be a little more efficient. And to be honest, I used to do that all the time, take the time to put tints and colors in there. But most of the time, patients either don't appreciate it or they actually didn't like it. When a patient pays a lot of money for posterior restoration, the last thing they want is for it to look like it has new decay. So one of the things I take the opportunity to do when I'm doing posterior restorations is to check to make sure the patient's hasn't lost at least canine riser function. And if they have beforehand, see interference, it's real easy to add just a little bit of a single shade, like a classic shade, and give the patient some cuspid rise so they're not ripping the heck out of your teeth. Their teeth. The other benefit is if you're going to replace a composite and give it really nice anatomy, if they've worn away all their guidance, then you pretty much have to do the same with the molar or the premolar. You have to make it pretty flat. So way back a long time ago, Ron Jackson wrote an article about the importance of techniques in preventing post-op sensitivity. And basically the conclusion of that article is all sensitivity is iatrogenic. So if the patient walks in, they don't have sensitivity, and they walk out and they do, we caused it. So that's kind of a tough pill to swallow sometimes, but that's a classic situation where somebody says, hey, I had this silver filling. You told me I need to replace. Now am I too sensitive or killing me? Why is that? So for me, my adhesive protocol is pretty simple. In the anterior, either total etch or selective enamel etch. And the posterior depends on the size of the restoration. And these are just a couple of studies, so don't take my word for it, that selective etch increases the bond strength, particularly on uncut enamel and cut enamel. So here I'm going to go through on a typodont, like a class 2. We're going to talk mostly about class 2s, but then some on class 1. And then I'm actually going to show you a case I just did. So class 2 prep, you're going to place your matrix, whatever your favorite matrix is, Garrison, Paladent, Trident, whatever a dent you want to use. You're going to wedge it, put the separating ring, and then I like SE Protect. So you're going to place primer and then bond, and advance. Scrub in the primer, air thin it out. So this is a technique that I learned a long time ago from Dr. Diastema, which is to always use flowable in the proximal box of a super thin layer in the box and a super thin layer on the floor as your first layer, and then light cure it. And then this is called a centripetal buildup. So centripetal buildup is taking all the proximal surfaces that are missing wherever they are and building them back up first so you have a class 1. So it's really interesting that I learned this back in 1999 from Dieter, and he learned it about 10 years previous from another dentist in Italy, I believe he was from. And now I noticed lately, like the last few years on the internet, everybody talks about it like it's new. Newsflash, guys and ladies, it's not new. It's been around a long time. It's just, especially in the US, we seem to be a little slow catching up. So centripetal buildup, and you use whatever you're going to use for your enamel shade. So if you're going to layer, this is your enamel shade. If you're not going to layer, this is whatever shade you're picking. There's a little different view. You light cure that. So each of these layers I show, the flowable gets light cured. The box, the proximal wall gets light cured. And I like to cut little resin forms. I don't like compules. Compules are by far the biggest seller, by far. But I like cutting little pieces of resin that fit for what I'm doing and then place them. So this is a layered technique, even the posterior. So I'm putting a darker shade in A3 on the buccal wall and curing it. And I'm putting A3 on the lingual wall and curing it. So I'm separating it, reducing the stress. I'm not connecting the two walls. And then I'm putting the transparent layer or another one of the enamel layers from ES2 over it, light curing it, taking the ring and the wedge off, clean up, adjust. Love scalpels. They're the only thing that cuts composite clean, whether it's proximal, the anterior, posterior. And then you can polish. You could, when you're finished, you could, especially if you're going to use something that's going to gouge up the composite. I used to etch them and put Discover LV over the surface and light cure it because it does not have an air inhibited layer when it's cured. And that'd be the final resin. So that's a layered posterior composite. Dentin shade, see the dentin showing through, and then enamel shade. So here is one with Majesty Universal. So this is going to be one color. And I'm giving you two examples at once. We have class 1, and I'm replacing this class 2. So there's preps, rough preps. And then again, whatever matrix makes you happy, use that matrix. Then here's selective etch, got a little sloppy there. And then this is Universal Quick, which is Kuraray's universal adhesive. So you place that, air thin it, light cure it. And then here, like I said before, every posterior composite I do has a thin layer of flowable underneath the first layer. So there's some flowable here, there's flowable here. And here's the most important part. Think about flowable has elastomeric properties. It's kind of like a rubber band. It'll stretch just a tiny little bit. So where do you want that the most? You want that right here in the proximal box. What you don't want to do is take your hybrid and try to pack it down in here because they trap air bubbles, have all sorts of issues. So you put the flowable in there, you take an Explorer or a probe, and you tease it up the sides. You light cure this, and now this is all sealed, and then you can place your composite of choice with confidence that you're not going to have air bubbles, leakage, all sorts of things like that. And like I said, because it has elastomeric properties, it stretches just a tiny little bit. Not like a rubber band, but kind of like one. So here's for purposes of this example, I did use a copule, even though I normally don't. I normally use syringes because that's how Dieter taught me to do this. And I cut those little pieces off. But copules are certainly a lot more, they're easier to use, they're efficient. Since I'm doing, as I'll show, I have a video here I'm going to show you later, a quick video of how I actually do this. I don't spend an inordinate amount of time. I don't do individual cusp buildups, but I'll do, say, the buccal wall and put the central groove and cure it, and then do the lingual wall, put some anatomy, cure it. Same with this. What I don't do is I don't connect two walls. Too much stress. That's where you see those white lines afterwards. And then with this one, I'm going to do like I showed you in the example, build up the proximal box, cure it, and then I'm going to build up the buccal wall, cure it, and the lingual wall, cure it, and then I'm all done. So this is simplified. Just a quick build up. These are called Compost sculpt instruments. I'm going to use those. You know what? If your anatomy gets too deep, one thing I learned is if I get a little too overzealous and these get cut too deep, patients will actually trap a little food in there. What you can do is take a little tiny bit of Flobo on Explorer and put that in there and that in there. Majesty and Majesty Flow, or ES2 Flow and Majesty Flow, excuse me, are both very highly filled. So if you put them in there, you don't have to worry about where, because they're very highly filled. So if you wanted to make that, let's say, less prominent or less of like a food catch, that's what you could do there. So that's the restorations. So this is before, that's after, that's one single shade. So now for any small to medium-sized posterior restoration, this is what I use. So no more, I'm not doing multiple shades in the posterior. If this is really big, if it's a big amalgam, it's cruising out towards a cusp or something like that, then so the Chameleon Composites, the way they work is they allow the color of the tooth, the color to be kind of transported through the material, and that's how it picks up the color, has a chameleon effect. The downside of that is the restoration is really big. Since the material is translucent, it'll get gray. So if you have a cusp that's undermined, or you're missing most of a cusp, or you have some like show through here, then what you're going to need to do for the big ones is I still have to put down a little bit of dentin or something underneath there to block that out. Otherwise, let's say this whole cusp was missing. If you used a universal, even one as great as this one works, it's going to get a little gray. So these are for small to medium-sized restoration. You can see those blend pretty well. And if you really like doing like upper end, the aesthetics and things like that, you can do that, but it takes a whole lot of time. So this is how I used to 20 years ago do things. And there's old restoration. Take it out. You can see it's even an old Garrison ring system. Put the matrix in there. I always notch it. And the reason I do that is because if you don't, you lose a reference point. And if you build the wall, the proximal wall, the ridge too high, then the rest of the restoration is high. And then you have to obliterate it in order to get back to some semblance of a normal looking tooth. Then the adhesive protocol again is your adhesive, light cure, flowable, light cure, proximal box, light cure. And this is where I was putting some dentin. There we go. Some dentin. And then I put a little bit of stain in there for fun. There you go. And enamel layer, and use the artist brush and smooth it off. And that would be the result. So that's great. And it's a lot of fun. And patients ask for that once in a while. But the majority of patients in my practice, and I venture to guess in most docs' practices, they want it light colored and they want it functional. So they don't want all this. And like I said, on a mandibular tooth, some patients even would complain about this. So it depends on what your patients want. Okay. So back in 2000, Ron and I wrote an article, The New Posterior Resins and a Simplified Placement Technique. And it's become even simpler because now there's a material I can use for just one shade. Where when we did the original article, we were using basically a dentin and an enamel. So here you're going to see a lot of similarities. So there's the bands, You need to pre-wedge when you're doing multiple teeth in order to get enough separation. The bands have been notched, like I talk about. That's a carbide round burr. Take it down to where the marginal ridge is. So now I have better sight of where I am. And see, notched. Then I clean them with Bisco cavity cleanser, selective etch, rinse it off, and SE Protect, or you can use All Bond Universal. You can use, whatever adhesive you like, and use them by the manufacturer specs because they're all different. Air dry and light cure, flowable on the floor and in the box, light cure, proximal walls, light cure. And then remember I said these were all pre-wedged. Now I've turned every class 2 into a class 1. So there's nothing easier than a class 1 and nothing more of a pain in the rear than a multi-surface MOD FL XYZ class 2. So these are those compost sculpt instruments I was talking about. So there, you can even, if the patient doesn't have perio problems, you can even take all the hardware off. If they do and you pop this all off, you're going to get some bleeding, then that could be a problem. I like to pop them off if I can. And now it's like the patient has a bunch of class 1s. And then I'm going to put in a layer in 2 increments, like I talked about. Buckle first, do a little anatomy cure at the lingual second. And I just flash cure them for 5 seconds and then full cure them. Before I do that, I could use these they're called T-pens. They're brushes of different sizes. They're from my Mycerium, and make a little anatomy. And there you go. So it's a pretty decent restoration. It's monochromatic, but it blends in pretty well. And then the nice thing about Majesty Flow is it's radiopaque. So you can make sure it's sealed, 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 sealed. Those ones I all did together, they're all sealed. There's your Majesty Flow. Okay, so what happens when you have multiple, like a whole quadrants of teeth to do? How can we speed this up a little bit? So you got to pre-wedge, like I talked about. And then pick your matrix of choice. Any of these will do, or whatever you like. And then here's the class 2 preps. So I've got 4 teeth in a quadrant. And basically what I'm doing, you can't separate them all, at least in my experience. You can't separate all 4 of these teeth sufficiently to do them all at the same time, but there's a system you can do this in. So they're prepped. Now, if you're going to use a self-adhesive, you have to think about, and even if you're using rubber dam, and a lot of times I don't use it, to be honest. I've become more of an Optigate guy. But even if you're using rubber dam, some of that, self-adhesive, self-etch, is going to get down on the root surface. And believe me, it's going to cure there when you light cure it. And that's going to cause issues. So even with floss placed around here, I have to find a way to contain the self-etch. And the way I do that is you end up putting some kind of matrices around all these. The easiest way to do is just good old Toffelmeyer from, the land of far, far away, long time ago. So SE Protect, Universal Quick, and light cure it. The reason, like I said, is you don't want this getting down on the root surfaces. And my son says, Dad, that looks kind of like a really bad Transformers movie. There's all this metal and stuff moving around. So then I take those off. Now I've only got adhesive actually in the preparations. And then the way I do this is you just pick a surface. You can do mesials first or distals first. So I do the mesials here. So there's a proximal. I do the mesial of these 2. So I separate these. The most wedges I'm doing at a time is 2. Wedge, wedge, add, close the proximal. Then add another one, close the distal, close the distal, close the distal. And so you can mix and match. We've got garrisons, we've got tridents. Now look, class 1, class 1, class 1, class 1. And nothing's easier than a class 1, especially compared to a class 2. And you can use your little forms like I do, or you can use compules, fill these in. There's just like minimum, I'm just using that T-pens to put a tiny little bit of anatomy in here. And that's it. So this is the pre-op of some old resins. Just going to show you kind of similar, a little bit different way. pre-wedge, preps when they're really deep. When I'm creeping up on the pulp, I like to use some Theracal as a liner, indirect pulp cap. So there's Theracal, and then clean out the preps. And we're going to use, you're going to pick your composite. So you can either do selective etch, you can do total etch. Then you're going to use your adhesive, either Adhesive Protect, Universal Quick, up on 3, whatever you like. And then here again, see, I've got all my matrices in, but I'm selectively restoring proximal surfaces a couple at a time. And doing flowable first, then I did the distal here, I'm doing the distal there. So distal, then I went back and I did distal and then mesial, fill them in. Again, use a little cut of composite like I do, or you can use Compul. And basically it's filling in the dentin layer and the enamel. You finish them on high dry with a carbide, and that's finished. So it's not super aesthetic, but it's very functional and very well sealed. How practical is multiple shades versus single or dual? So like I said, there's some cases I've done 6, 7, 8 shades of composite. That's kind of crazy. So in this case, a couple small breaks. I used a tiny little bit of dentin, just a little bit, so it's not too translucent, and then a little bit of enamel over it. And then that's the result. So I think 2 shades can be very practical. Or this is another 2-shade case. Clean out the stained areas, single of these of 8, 9, put dentin in there, because if you just put enamel in here, or even if you just put a classic, it's still going to be translucent right there. It's going to look unnatural. So put dentin in, put a little enamel over it, good to go. This is a patient who, we talk about how smile makeovers are, 10 teeth or 20 teeth, and how life-changing they are, and they can be. But for this patient, she broke this tooth the night or the morning of prom. So think of how terrible that would be as a young lady that's go to prom with your tooth like that. So she gave me a call. We got her in, and I asked her, I said, can I just do something quick? Because I'm kind of working her between patients. And I used a dentin shade and enamel shade. That's it. And restored that. And with that, she got a really nice result, and it ended up being permanent, not temporary. She had it for years and years, still has it now. Here's a case. I restore a lot of patients who've had orthodontics done, and then, the orthodontist can put the teeth in the right or almost right place, but then they can't change the shape, obviously, or if they're missing a lateral or something like that. So this patient came to me with already completed ortho, wanted a little bigger laterals. So did a little tissue raise, add a little bit of dentin shade on the sides and some enamel. So 2 shades, and that looks pretty decent. So I think a lot of cases, I do most of my anterior cases now in 2 instead of 6 or 8. Or here's another post ortho touch up where patients had some composite issues before ortho, certainly has some after. This is patient doesn't even need anesthetic. I'm just cleaning up old resin and scratches and things, etching, bonding, and then adding a little bit of dentin, a tiny little bit, and some enamel shade. Or this patient who actually had a tooth that was deformed. So I built this up in almost all in dentin, and then put a really thin layer of enamel over it. This is actually, it's called Mycerium Ena. It's Dr. Vanini's product. And so he's super happy with that young man. And so here's the first set of composite veneers I ever did, long time ago, when I had no idea what I was doing, because composite was considered heresy when I was in dental school. We weren't allowed to do it. So patient comes to me, luckily for me, family member, which means if you mess up, you have some graces. So I used TPH to do this. So it's pretty durable. And over 24 years, he chipped it at a couple places you could see, and then the office I was at, of course, we didn't have matching composite. So basically my brother came back because he wanted the teeth lighter, like everybody would. And so that's what I did. So we take some photos, we work some stuff out. So this is what my brother wanted. So I did that, but I think it looks a little too unnatural. So I pretty much begged him. I said, please let me do a tiny little cut back and make this 2 layers. So this is just 1 layer of basically a dentin shade because he wanted it really white. And then I ended up putting a thin layer of a more transparent enamel over it with a little bit of color for cutback. And that's the final result. So I think that looks a little more natural than the left looks more natural than the right. That's my opinion. Let's see. Like I said, family members, you can experiment on. It's allowed. Kelly came from another state to have her teeth done. So I'm going to go through this real quick. I did a mock-up in her mouth because we didn't have a wax up ahead of time. And then I had the lab do wax up, made a stent. Most of you folks have probably seen this on one of the sites on the internet. And so that's her before, that's after, that's 2 shades. It's an enamel shade and a dentin shade. So these are cases I just did. In fact, they did a video with Mike DeTola where he interviewed me about doing these cases. So these are single shade. So the left one is, we'll call it a class 5. And one of the things I learned from Dieter is that when you have stain like this, that's overextended, unfinished composite, it just stains. This could be poor adhesive technique, poor isolation, poor whatever, who knows. So this is cleaned up, proper adhesive technique. You can tell it's corded here because this is immediate post-op, it's all chewed up. And then a thin layer of Majesty Flow, like cure that, and then put Majesty Universal 1 shade over that. And you can see, because obviously the root has more chroma, the enamel has less, and it picks it up like very nicely. So this can be used for a lot of things. The 2 cases I'm going to show you here, I kind of stretched the limits to see, I wanted to see at what point it would get gray. So this to me still looks pretty good. And the gums will look better in about a week or so. And then diastema, this is about as wide as I would want to go with any Chameleon composite. So this again, stretching the boundaries to see how wide can I make this and have it not be gray. You don't want it to look like there's a chunk of gray material in here. So this is Majesty Universal, single shade. Again, just a tiny, when I prepare these and get them ready and they're all cleaned up and ready to go, I'll still put a tiny little bit of flow ball on there. And then that's the actual hybrid itself. So thanks for listening. We're going to do a question and answer.
Please feel free to drop them in the chat at Q&A. I know there was one question early on asking what kind of matrix you used.
I use Tridents, Triodents. I use Garrison. I use some Paladins, and sometimes I cut pieces of Tafelmeyer if the situation I feel calls for it. So those are probably my go-to ones. That helps any.
We got another question that came in here. Let's see. Can you please share what matrix system for anteriors, especially in that case where you close the diastema?
Okay. I use the little, it's terrible, I can't think of the name at the moment. The little metal matrices that are already pre-curved. And this is one of the times I wish we did have live video so I could just show one. But I've been using those for like 20 some years, the little metal curved ones. If you want to give the attendees my email, I'll be glad to send the name of that to whoever would like to have it.
Sure, I can paste it in the chat.
Yeah, because off the top of my head, I can't think it, and I could grab some in like 10 seconds, but I can't show them, unfortunately. Yeah.
Another question that came in, how do you prep the diastema restorations?
So I prep them. Yeah, I can start to see those now. So I prep those that's one of the times I definitely use rubber dam to retract, that big papilla, and then light prep with a super fine diamond, and then actually use a micro etcher very carefully to make sure that all the biofilm's off of there. Because if you have any biofilm, you can't bond. It doesn't matter. You can't etch off biofilm. It's got to be cleaned off mechanically. So it's a micro diamond and then micro etching to prep.
Perfect. I'm not seeing any other questions. So if folks want to hang on, we can if you want to try and pull up that video one more time, we've got some time left.
Okay.
Otherwise, if we can't figure it out today, I'll talk with you, Dr. Morgan, and we can see if we can fit it into the recording.
Well, there's a question about like bulk fill.
Yep, go for it.
So bulk fill, there are few first years in life, taxes, death, things like that. And composites shrink, all composites shrink. So bulk fills are built around the premise that they shrink less, but they still shrink. So, when you get something, you give up something, at least in dentistry, usually in life. So when some of the upside properties of bulk fill, first of all, they still have a limit to how deep they will cure. And then without going into all the details of adhesion and all the issues with stress that's put on the tooth and mostly on the adhesive bond itself, especially on the floor of the restoration. I'm much more comfortable with taking, like, say, Majesty Universal and just putting a buccal layer, curing it, and a lingual layer, curing it, and calling it a day, instead of putting one giant mask. If you put one giant mask, you connect the, let's say, buccal and lingual walls or all the walls, you put a tremendous amount of stress on the tooth when you light cure, even if it's a bulk fill, even though they say, oh, but we only shrink X, well, they still shrink. And that's when you see the white lines at the margins. And so there's structural issues. There's issues. Most dentists don't either never seen or they don't know that the composites actually can lift off the floor of the prep from the stress, from the shrinkage. So Dr. Tagami's done some great videos on that, showing the composites actually lifting off the floor. So I would, as I said, I'd much rather take, for trying to simplify, and that's what bulk fill is for, then I would rather do universal and do the buccal, cure it, than do lingual, cure it, and call it a two-step bulk fill, but it's still a lot less stress than putting a bulk fill in. And bulk fills in general aren't very aesthetic, and this universal composite, I think, is very aesthetic. So that's my kind of take on that. What do you use to sculpt and finalize the restoration? So those instruments I showed, they're in primary colors. They're yellow, red, green, and blue. Honestly, I use the yellow and the green. I almost never use the blue or the red. Those were actually designed by Dr. Diastema back like 20 years ago. They're called Compost Sculpt, and I can send those, the spelling of that to anybody who would like. Actually, it's COMPU and then capital SCULPT, Compost Sculpt. And I know they were sold to one company and then sold to another, but I'm sure I haven't had to buy any because I've had plenty of them and they're durable as heck. And the other thing is you can change out the tips and customize them, which is just amazing. But if you Google that, with the way Google works, I'm sure you can find someone who sells those these days. They're too great not to be sold. So that's what I use.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan, for your time today. And thank you to Kuraray for sponsoring this webinar. If anyone has additional questions about this topic, please email us at webinars@henryschein.com. Additionally, if anyone is interested in attending future Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. Thank you all for joining us and have a great night.
Thank you.